Welcome to today's lecture, where we'll explore personality disorders through a trauma informed lens, focusing on accurate diagnosis and understanding behaviors as potential adaptations to adversity. In this lecture, we'll explore the diagnostic criteria for personality disorders and examine common challenges in accurate diagnosis. So let's begin with a foundational question. What is a personality disorder? A personality disorder is described as an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from cultural expectations in two or more areas. And this enduring pattern is key. It isn't something that occurs solely in response to trauma or specific circumstances, but persists over time and across contexts. And when we assess for personality disorders, we look at these four areas of functioning: cognition, which is how a person perceives and interprets themselves, others, and the world; affectivity, the range, intensity, lability, and appropriateness of emotional expression. Is the person's affect consistent with their cultural and social context? Interpersonal functioning, how the individual navigates relationships. And again, this must be considered within the cultural and social norms relevant to them. And impulse control, how well somebody manages their impulses and behaviors in various situations. And as far as key diagnostic features, we look at inflexibility and pervasiveness. So, unlike situational or domain specific traits like narcissistic behaviors seen only at work, a personality disorder reflects traits that are rigid and present across most areas of a person's life. Developmental onset. These patterns typically emerge no later than adolescence or early adulthood, although signs may sometimes be observed in childhood. And for those under 18, symptoms must persist for at least a year, with some exceptions, such as antisocial personality disorder, which can't be diagnosed before age 18, but is often preceded by conduct disorder. And then we look at exclusion or alternative explanations. So the traits and behaviors cannot be better explained by other mental disorders, medical conditions, or substance use. For example, somebody exhibiting traits that might suggest borderline personality disorder may actually be experiencing complex post traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, or the after effects of significant trauma. And we do want to consider trauma. Many behaviors associated with personality disorders can also be understood as adaptive responses to adverse childhood experiences or chronic trauma. From this perspective, behaviors that were once protective in a threatening environment may no longer serve the individual in their current life, contributing to clinically significant distress now. Though CPTSD is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM 5TR, it offers an important lens through which we can explore these patterns. And when considering a diagnosis, it's vital to differentiate between behaviors rooted in trauma versus those stemming from enduring personality patterns. Also, we're going to look at a cultural context for everything. So, we must also account for cultural expectations when diagnosing personality disorders. What may seem unusual or deviant in one cultural framework may be entirely normative in another. And this includes consideration of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and generational differences. So, for each of these personality disorders, I'm going to describe them, but I'm also going to give you a mnemonic to help you follow along and remember them. So, starting with paranoid personality disorder, it's characterized by a pervasive pattern of distrust and suspicion of others beginning in childhood or adolescence. It's relatively rare, representing approximately zero point 0.5 to 4.5% of the general United States population. Paranoid personality disorder often manifests early, with children showing signs such as social withdrawal, hypersensitivity, poor peer relationships, and social anxiety. Underachievement in school is common, and these patterns of psychotic symptoms to differentiate paranoid personality disorder from conditions like schizophrenia or mood disorders with psychotic features. The distinguishing factor is that paranoid ideation in paranoid personality disorder occurs without the presence of hallucinations or delusions typical of psychotic disorders. So if you haven't watched the schizophrenia lecture yet, maybe stop here, watch that one, come back. And again, I'm going to say the distinguishing factor occurs without the presence of hallucinations or delusions. So this makes it important to assess for concurrent symptoms carefully. So the mnemonic here is suspect. S stands for suspicious of others' motives. This is a pervasive pattern of mistrust and doubt about others' intentions. U is for unforgiving and begrudging, difficulty letting go of perceived slights or betrayals, suspicious of infidelity or disloyalty. So there's going to be frequent accusations or fears about disloyalty in relationships. Perceives attacks in benign remarks, so is going to misinterpret neutral statements or actions as hostile. E is for enemy or friend dichotomy, views people as all good or all bad with no middle ground. Confiding in others is feared. There's a reluctance to share personal information due to distrust. And threats perceived in benign events, heightened vigilance and hyperawareness of potential threats. So, paranoid personality disorder and trauma. To understand it through a trauma informed lens, it's helpful to explore how these traits may have developed as survival strategies in response to adverse childhood experiences, complex trauma, or intergenerational trauma. So, for instance, suspiciousness of others' motives might arise in environments where caregivers were distrustful or manipulative, creating a schema that others cannot be trusted. Unforgiving and begrudging tendencies could stem from repeated betrayals or instances where the child's trust was violated, and over time, these traits become protective barriers against future harm. Hypervigilance and misinterpretation of benign remarks could develop in households marked by anger, anxiety, unpredictability, where the child learned to read subtle cues for potential danger. And these traits, while maladaptive in adulthood, may have been essential for emotional survival in a chaotic or unsafe environment. So it's critical to shift the narrative surrounding personality disorders to reduce stigma. Instead of asking, "Why are you behaving this way?" we should ask, "What happened to you?" And this language change aligns with the trauma informed care models, emphasizing empathy and understanding over judgment. So, behaviors such as avoiding vulnerability or distrusting others are not about being difficult, but reflect survival skills shaped by past experiences. Recognizing these patterns allows clinicians to approach clients with curiosity and compassion, supporting healing rather than reinforcing stigma. And paranoid personality disorder is unrepresented in TV and film compared to other personality disorders. It has subtler traits. Its pervasive mistrust and hypervigilance might not lend themselves to the dramatic plot twists in the same way as other disorders like borderline or antisocial personality disorder. So, this cultural absence might reflect its rarity or the difficulty of portraying the nuanced patterns in engaging ways. Schizoid personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression. Like other personality disorders, schizoid personality disorder requires the presence of four or more diagnostic criteria to meet the threshold. However, even when individuals fall just short of the criteria, the behaviors and symptoms still merit therapeutic attention. So the mnemonic here is distant. D is for detached or flattened affect. People with schizoid personality disorder often appear unemotional or indifferent, reacting passively to both positive and adverse circumstances. And this flat affect may reflect the neurological impact of chronic trauma or stress, as prolonged adversity can lead to dysregulated stress response system. This system essentially turns down emotional sensitivity to conserve energy in overwhelming environments. So, a fitting analogy here would be like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, who just passively accepts life's events without strong emotional reactions. I is for indifference to criticism or praise. And they often build walls to protect themselves, thinking, "You can't hurt me, but you also can't love me." Sex is of little interest. Chronic stress or trauma can dysregulate mood and libido as the brain remains in survival mode rather than focusing on reproduction. Tasks are usually done solitarily, and avoiding people reduces stress. Solitary activities feel safer, as social interactions may have been painful or untrustworthy in the past. There's usually an absence of close friends, so these individuals neither desire nor enjoy close relationships, which often develop from repeated interpersonal hurt. The ice cream analogy works pretty well here. If every time you eat ice cream, you get sick, eventually you may convince yourself that you don't want ice cream anymore, even if you once loved it. No desire for close relationships, so over time, repeated disappointments may extinguish even the desire for connection. And trouble enjoying activities. People with schizoid personality disorder often exhibit a muted ability to experience pleasure or excitement, and this can reflect both reduced emotional reactivity and potential alterations in dopamine pathways. So, from a trauma informed perspective, the traits associated with schizoid personality disorder may be adaptive survival mechanisms formed in response to chronic adversity. If relationships were sources of pain or betrayal, distancing from others becomes a form of self protection. Exposure to stress may dull emotional responses to conserve energy and minimize vulnerability. A child raised in an invalidating or hostile environment may learn to seek safety in solitude. Now, this isn't to say that everybody with schizoid personality disorder is coming from an upbringing that was traumatic. This is just trying to give a little bit of voice to those who have had a traumatic upbringing. Accurate diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder requires ruling out other conditions with overlapping features. So, you might want to consider paranoid personality disorder. Does the individual avoid others due to suspicion and fear of harm, or due to a lack of interest and emotional connection? So, the lack of interest and emotional connection would be schizoid personality disorder, versus suspicion and harm would be the paranoid personality disorder that we just talked about. We might also consider a persistent depressive disorder. So, depressive disorders may sometimes mimic schizoid personality disorder with low energy, lack of pleasure, and emotional blunting. However, depressive disorders often include subjective distress and a desire for connection, which is absent in the schizoid personality disorder. And as far as schizophrenia spectrum disorders, if hallucinations, delusions, or disorganized thinking are present, the diagnosis may shift to schizophrenia spectrum rather than a schizoid personality disorder. So, again, hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, that's what we're looking for on schizophrenia spectrum. We might also want to consider autism spectrum disorders. So, individuals with autism may appear emotionally detached or socially isolated, but their behaviors often stem from sensory or neurological differences rather than lack of emotional capacity or interest in relationships. Additionally, those with autism may experience complex trauma due to invalidating environments in childhood, contributing to compensatory behaviors that resemble schizoid personality disorder. And I think a useful fictional example here is Bruce Wayne or Batman. Bruce Wayne lives a solitary life, avoids close relationships, maintains a flat affect, except in moments of intense focus on his mission. And interestingly, some interpretations suggest that Batman is his authentic self, while Bruce Wayne is a socially acceptable mask. His limited emotional engagement and lack of enjoyment in life parallels schizoid personality disorder traits, highlighting the detachment and isolation that characterize the disorder. Schizotypal personality disorder is often described as schizoid plus magical thinking and odd behavior. So it's characterized by a pervasive pattern of social and interpersonal deficits, like we just talked about with the schizoid personality disorder, but it also has cognitive or perceptual distortions and eccentric behaviors. So, to meet the diagnostic threshold, individuals must exhibit five or more criteria. And the mnemonic here is me peculiar. So, there's magical thinking, which just means that beliefs defy conventional logic or science, such as telepathy, superstitions, or a belief about their ability to predict future events. Experiences unusual perceptions, and these can include altered perceptions of sights, sounds, smells that might not align with reality. So, for example, interpreting a common sound as uniquely significant or perceiving objects differently than others. Persistent distrust or suspicion of others' intentions would be the paranoid ideation for P. E is eccentric behavior or odd appearance, dressing, speaking, or moving in ways that appear peculiar or unconventional to others. Constricted or inappropriate affect, emotional responses that seem limited or mismatched to the situation. Unusual thinking or speech, so that's going to be speech that's vague, metaphorical, or overly elaborate, or idiosyncratic, making it hard for others to follow. Generally lacking close friends and having a difficulty forming and maintaining close relationships, often due to discomfort or fear of social interaction. And ideas of reference, that just means misinterpreting external events as being specifically related to oneself. So, for example, believing that a favorite song was written just for them or that a broken item reflects their personal failure. A stands for anxiety in social situations, high levels of social anxiety that persist despite familiarity with others, often linked to paranoid fears. And then R stands for making sure that we remember to rule out psychotic or developmental disorders. So, schizotypal personality disorder does not include full blown psychosis or the developmental patterns of autism spectrum disorder. As far as some developmental considerations regarding this magical thinking in children versus adults, it's normal for children to engage in magical thinking. It's part of imaginative play and cognitive development. For adults, however, persistent magical thinking may suggest schizotypal personality disorder if it interferes with functioning. And some differential diagnoses to consider would be substance use. So, substances like LSD or any of those hallucinogens can cause prolonged perceptual disturbances and paranoid ideation, which might mimic schizotypal personality disorder. And substance use just has to be ruled out to confirm this diagnosis of a personality disorder. We also want to rule out anything on the schizophrenia spectrum. So, while schizotypal shares some features with schizophrenia, like unusual perceptions, paranoid thoughts, it lacks sustained psychosis, such as hallucinations or delusions. And we'd also want to rule out autism spectrum disorders. Both conditions may include social difficulties and odd behaviors, but the thought patterns in schizotypal, like magical thinking or ideas of reference, differentiate it from autism. And understanding schizotypal traits through trauma informed lens allows us to explore how these behaviors may have developed as a coping mechanism. Paranoid ideation may stem from environments where safety and trust were inconsistent. Magical thinking could represent attempts to make sense of a chaotic or unpredictable world. And social withdrawal often reflects a protective mechanism to avoid potential harm or rejection. And some fictional examples for this personality disorder might be Kramer from Seinfeld. He displays eccentric behaviors, odd speech, unconventional thinking. There's Doc Brown from Back to the Future. He has unconventional appearance, idiosyncratic thinking, and enthusiasm for peculiar ideas that would reflect schizotypal patterns. And this last one that I can think of is Willy Wonka from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So he exhibits magical thinking. He's eccentric with his behavior and has an unusual affect that aligns with schizotypal personality disorder characteristics. Up next, we have avoidant personality disorder, and that one's characterized by a pervasive pattern of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. These traits often manifest in behaviors aimed at avoiding potential rejection, judgment, or shame. The mnemonic here is cringes. C is for certainty of being liked before getting involved. Individuals with avoidant personality disorders seek assurance and acceptance before engaging in relationships, minimizing their risk of rejection. And rejection will preoccupy their thoughts. Persistent fear of rejection shapes their behaviors and decision making, often leading to avoidance of social interactions. Intimacy is restrained due to fear of being shamed. Avoidance of emotional, cognitive, or physical closeness stems from fear of humiliation or ridicule. New relationships are inhibited. Even when initiating new relationships, individuals may remain withdrawn, cautiously keeping emotional and social barriers in place. Gets around occupational activities involving others. So there might be a preference for working independently or maybe even now working from home remotely, and it's common to avoid potential judgment or interpersonal conflict. E stands for embarrassment, prevents new activities. Fear of failure or ridicule often prevents them from trying new hobbies, skills, even in private. And self is viewed as unappealing or inferior. Chronic feelings of inadequacy and low self worth are central features reinforcing their avoidance behaviors. Diagnosing avoidant personality disorder requires careful differentiation from other conditions that share similar traits. So, this might sound a lot like social anxiety disorder, and there is a significant overlap between avoidant personality disorder and a social anxiety disorder. The DSM 5 TR notes that theoretically, Individuals with social anxiety disorder do not exhibit pervasive low self esteem, but the distinction's debated. Consider whether the individual's avoidance stems from a hypersensitivity to rejection in all areas of life, that would be the avoidant personality disorder, versus specific social situations, and that would be the social anxiety disorder. We might also want to consider body dysmorphic disorder, and that can lead to social withdrawal and avoidance, but the underlying issue is preoccupation with perceived physical flaws, not fear of rejection based on interpersonal inadequacy. Related to that, we might also consider an eating disorder, and that's going to be low self esteem and avoidance of social interactions. But those behaviors are secondary to the preoccupation with body weight or food. And other personality disorders, we always want to rule those out. So consider comorbid traits or overlapping features with dependent or schizoid personality disorders, which may share that social withdrawal, but differ in the underlying motivations. And it's also important to address the stigma often associated with personality disorder diagnoses. Where possible, prioritizing diagnosing social anxiety disorder or other conditions before assigning a personality disorder label, as social anxiety carries less stigma and may better align with the client's experience. So, some practical examples of avoidant personality disorder in action might look like a person avoiding applying for a new job because they fear not being liked by their coworkers. They might decline an invitation to a party, preoccupied by the thought that others will criticize them. Or even in established relationships, they might withhold personal thoughts or emotions due to fear of being ridiculed. Dependent personality disorder is characterized by an excessive need to be taken care of, leading to submissive and clinging behaviors and fears of separation. To meet diagnostic threshold, individuals must exhibit five or more criteria from the DSM 5, and the mnemonic here is reliance. R stands for reassurance is required for decisions. People have difficulty making decisions without excessive advice or reassurance from others. Expressing disagreement is difficult, often avoids conflict out of fear of losing support or being punished. Life responsibilities are assumed by others, so they might rely heavily on others to manage key aspects of their life. Initiating projects is difficult, a lack of confidence and motivation hinders their ability to act independently. Alone feels helpless and uncomfortable. Experiences intense distress when alone due to fears of being unable to manage on their own. Nurturance is sought excessively, will go to extreme lengths to gain care and support, even if it means sacrificing their own needs or well being. Companionship is urgently sought when a relationship ends. So we're quickly seeking a new relationship to replace the emotional security of a lost one. And the E stands for exaggerated fears and being left to care for themselves, persistent and irrational fear of abandonment and self sufficiency. Individuals with dependent personality disorder often grow up in families where autonomy is discouraged and strict control is maintained. Caregivers may reject attempts at independence, reinforcing the belief that safety and acceptance come only from dependence. And the dynamics of addicted families marked by control, secrecy, and emotional invalidation, like don't talk, don't trust, don't feel, can foster dependency and a fear of self sufficiency. And repeated experiences of being told they were wrong or punished for asserting independence create deep seated fears of failure and rejection. These early experiences condition individuals to rely on others for validation and care while avoiding risks that might lead to conflict or abandonment. The criteria for dependent personality disorder also serve as treatment targets for helping clients build independence and self efficacy. So, some examples might include we would look at the difficulty initiating projects, explore the barriers such as low confidence or fear of failure, encourage clients to identify goals that they might pursue if they felt more empowered, and support them in setting small, achievable goals to build confidence and a sense of personal agency. Or when we look at the fear of being alone, we'd work on gradually increasing the client's ability to manage time and activities independently, helping them to build resilience and reduce feelings of helplessness. For excessive need of reassurance, we'd encourage clients to develop decision making skills by practicing low stakes choices and reflecting on their own inner resources. We want to make sure that we consider cultural norms about dependence and caregiving to avoid pathologizing behavior that aligns with cultural expectations. And I'm thinking of a fictional example here. It's Buster Bluth from Arrested Development. And Buster's overly dependent relationship with his mother, Lucille, exemplifies the enmeshment often seen in dependent personality disorder. Lucille's controlling and invalidating parental style fosters his inability to develop confidence or autonomy. He avoids taking risks, he fears abandonment, and he clings to relationships for a sense of safety. His exaggerated helplessness and need for constant guidance fit well with the criteria for dependent personality disorder. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this character or the show, you are missing out. So here's an example of Buster's dependent personality in his relationship with his mother, Lucille, in the episode where Buster tries to join the army. So that's season 1, episode 13, and it's titled Beef Consomme. So a little scene breakdown here. Lucille pressures Buster to become more independent, but it's clear she doesn't actually want him to leave her side. In response, Buster impulsively decides to join the army. And Buster initially considers joining the army not because of personal ambition, but because he's influenced by others and kind of funny by a misleading recruitment video. He immediately second guesses his choice, turning to Lucille and others for reassurance about whether he's doing the right thing. We have this fear of disagreement even after realizing that the army is not for him. Buster is too scared to openly defy Lucille's subtle manipulation, which leads him to stick with the decision longer than he actually wants. He's helpless without support, so once he starts basic training, Buster struggles hilariously, displaying an exaggerated inability to function in an independent, structured environment without his mother's guidance. His breakdown in the training exercises shows his discomfort and helplessness in being away from Lucille. And by the end of the storyline, Buster predictably quits the army and returns to his mother, reaffirming his deep reliance on her and his inability to function without her constant oversight. And so this example demonstrates many traits of dependent personality disorder, but we're really focusing on that reassurance for decisions. Buster's decision making process is entirely based on external input, not his own agency. The fear of being alone, his disastrous attempt to be independent shows his extreme discomfort and the ineffectiveness when he's left to manage on his own. And the excessive need for nurturance. Buster ultimately returns to Lucille, showing his inability to cope with separation or autonomy. And this scene is a comedic exaggeration, but it perfectly captures the essence of the dependent personality disorder through Buster's over the top dependency on Lucille and his reluctance to break away even when his independence is encouraged. So, we want to talk here about obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is not the same as obsessive compulsive disorder, right? We're talking about personality disorders in this lecture. So, this is OCPD, not OCD. They're two distinct conditions. And while OCD involves intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors aimed at reducing anxiety, PD is defined by a rigid preoccupation with order, perfection, and control in all areas of life. And the mnemonic law firms captures the defining traits of OCPD. So L is for loses point of activity, preoccupied with rules, details, and order to the extent that they lose sight of the overall goal. They might miss the forest for the trees. There's an ability to complete tasks that's compromised by perfectionism. So tasks often go unfinished because they must meet impossible standards that they set for themselves. Worthless objects are kept, so they have difficulty discarding items, even those with no value, due to a perceived need to maintain control or prepare for hypothetical situations. Friendships and leisure are excluded for work, so social and recreational activities are sacrificed in favor of productivity. Inflexible, scrupulous, or overly conscientious, so excessive adherence to moral, ethical, or value driven standards that go beyond cultural or religious norms. They're reluctant to delegate. They micromanage others. They're unwilling to trust others unless they strictly follow their exact guidelines. They have a miserly spending style. They're frugal with both themselves and others, believing resources must be conserved for future needs. And they have a little bit of stubbornness and rigidity, which I just tend to love in my clients with this diagnosis. They adhere to routines and past methods, refusing to entertain flexibility or innovation. and some differential diagnoses. And before we talk about differential diagnoses, you might be looking through this and saying, like, yeah, I kind of meet these criteria. Again, what we really want to stress when we're looking at diagnosis of a disorder is that it meets clinically significant distress. So, are these things getting in the way of you living a life worth living? And if so, then you might meet criteria for a diagnosis. If you're moving through your world just fine and doing some of these things, then you probably don't meet criteria for a diagnosis. So, differential diagnoses, we would look at obsessive compulsive disorder. So, it's the OCD without the personality. So, OCD involves anxiety driven intrusive thoughts and compulsions, while the personality disorder reflects pervasive personality traits focused on control and perfectionism. OCD behaviors are unwanted, while OCPD behaviors are viewed as necessary or correct by the individual. We'd also want to rule out autism spectrum disorder. Both can involve rigid adherence to routines, but autism often includes social communication deficits and sensory sensitivities, which are not characteristic of obsessive compulsive personality disorder. We'd also want to look at a hoarding disorder. So while OCPD involves holding on to objects, it stems from perfectionism and control, whereas hoarding is driven by emotional attachment to possessions. Schizoid personality disorder. So, both disorders here can involve social withdrawal, but schizoid personality disorder is rooted in emotional detachment rather than a focus on work or productivity. And when we're breaking this down as far as a trauma informed perspective and trying to see where some of these traits might be coming from, perfectionism might develop in response to a fear of criticism or punishment in childhood where mistakes were not tolerated by caregivers. Inflexibility might come from this rigid adherence to routines and rules, and it can emerge as a way to create predictability in a chaotic or inconsistent environment. The preoccupation with work and productivity may reflect a need to feel valued or useful, especially in households where worth was tied to achievement. And some fictional examples that I can think of are Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. He's obsessed with structure, rules, routines. Sheldon exhibits many traits of obsessive compulsive personality disorders, such as reluctance to delegate and difficulty with flexibility or change. There's Howard Hughes, known for his rigid perfectionism in his work and personal life. Hughes also displayed hoarding behaviors, so that fits a little bit better with the obsessive compulsive personality disorder profile. And there's Dwight Schrute from The Office. So Dwight's adherence to rules, love of order, and the need to be in control are classic obsessive compulsive personality disorder traits. He's inflexible, he micromanages tasks on the farm and at work, and demonstrates preoccupation with ethical standards that often leads to conflicts with coworkers. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard and violation of the rights of others. This begins in childhood or adolescence with a diagnosis of conduct disorder before age 15. The mnemonic here is corrupt. Conformity to the law is lacking. Repeatedly engages in unlawful behaviors without concern for legal consequences. Obligations are ignored. Fails to fulfill responsibilities at work, school, home, often due to disinterest or impulsivity. Reckless disregard for safety. This one's a really important one. Engages in risky activities without concern for the well being of themselves or others. Remorse is lacking. Displays an absence of guilt or empathy for harm caused to others. U stands for underhanded. So there's some words here that I don't love using. I think that they come with a little bit of a stigma, but it's described as deceitful and manipulative, often using lying, conning, or exploiting others for personal gain. P stands for planning is insufficient, acts impulsively without forethought or consideration of the consequences. And T is for temper, so exhibits irritability, aggressiveness, or frequent angry outbursts, often leading to conflicts with others. And this one gets highly stigmatized. I think sometimes it's really difficult to look at it through a trauma informed perspective, but I want to look at each of these diagnostic criteria and break them down a little bit. So, conformity to the law is lacking. Growing up in environments where unlawful behaviors are normalized can lead to internalize these actions as survival strategies. Institutionalized individuals may become acculturated to the rules of prison or similar environments. Chronic stress, oppression, or depression can make fulfilling obligations feel meaningless or overwhelming, particularly when they bring no pleasure or sense of accomplishment. Reckless disregard can come from risk taking behaviors that may stem from a need to feel powerful or to seek adrenaline or dopamine in the absence of healthier emotional outlets. Lack of remorse or empathy can be protective. For some individuals, a lack of empathy is a learned response forged by repeated experiences of betrayal or harm, leading to the belief if no one cares about me, why should I care about anyone else? Underhanded behavior, lying or conning, may be modeled in environments where manipulation is necessary for survival. These behaviors can become ingrained as coping mechanisms. So, I have an example here from Breaking Bad. So, in the episode, it's season 5, episode 8. Walter White is demonstrating his capacity for underhanded behavior while skillfully manipulating and lying to cover his tracks. So basically, Walter orchestrates the murder of multiple prison inmates who could testify against him, ensuring his drug empire remains intact. The underhanded behavior comes in when Walter lies to his family and business associates about his intentions, creating a messy web of deceit to maintain control and protect his position. He manipulates others, including his business partner Jesse, believing he's taking these actions for greater good of the operation. So, why this might fit with antisocial personality disorder is Walter's manipulative tactics were initially motivated by survival and desire to provide for his family after his cancer diagnosis. However, as the series progresses, these behaviors become habitual, reflecting a deeper shift in his personality. Walter's actions show how underhanded behaviors, when repeated and reinforced, evolve from situational tactics into ingrained traits. Walter's manipulations initially stem from desperations. He's thrust into a world where lying and conning are necessary for survival. Over time, however, his willingness to exploit and deceive becomes second nature, aligning with traits of antisocial personality disorder. And this trajectory highlights how exposure to high stress, high risk environments can entrench underhanded behaviors as a core coping mechanism. So you might even want to start considering, like, is this a personality disorder, or are these behaviors manifesting solely because of the social environment and systems that he's in? Are the behaviors pervasive? Do they happen outside of his drug manufacturing work? And if you watch Breaking Bad, you can see how after 5 seasons, the character of Walter White really starts to develop into something that didn't seem like was present at the beginning of the series. So we ask, were these behaviors always there, or did they manifest? Because remember, for antisocial personality disorder, conduct disorder before age 15 has to either be diagnosed or he'd have to have met criteria for it. So, do we even know enough about Walter's childhood to be able to make that diagnosis? But if the answer is no, he doesn't meet criteria for a conduct disorder, then he wouldn't meet criteria for the antisocial personality disorder, regardless of his behaviors now. And just kind of going back to that mnemonic, I got off track a little bit, but that last part, the T for temper, so irritability and aggression. So, aggressiveness might serve as a defensive strategy, particularly in hostile or abusive environments. So we might look at these traits more as a survival skill set. While maladaptive in adulthood, it often had a lot of utility in unsafe or unstable childhood environments. And some differential diagnoses here might be an addictive disorder. Substance use might just lead to behaviors of lying, impulsivity, and neglecting obligations, but those would be secondary to addiction rather than reflective of a pervasive personality pattern. We'd want to look at mania and hypomania. So during manic episodes, individuals might exhibit impulsivity, irritability, or reckless behavior, but these behaviors are episodic rather than chronic. And we'd also want to look at trauma and PTSD. Individuals with trauma history might exhibit traits similar to antisocial personality disorders, such as aggression, lack of empathy, as survival mechanisms. And the presence of intrusive symptoms like flashbacks or hypervigilance suggests PTSD over antisocial. So, some fictional examples of antisocial personality disorder: Hannibal Lecter from The Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal demonstrates charm, manipulation, a lack of remorse, and violent disregard for others. The Joker in The Dark Knight It's a quintessential example of recklessness, impulsivity, and a complete lack of empathy for human life. So I know that these two examples really kind of paint a bad picture of this personality disorder. So let's flip it to something that might be considered a good guy. So James Bond. So he's often debated. Bond's character, his charm, his manipulation, his disregard for his safety and other safety might reflect antisocial personality disorder traits. However, his motivations often are tied to larger ideals, so it sort of complicates the diagnosis a little bit. So, while antisocial personality disorder behaviors may evoke strong reactions, a trauma informed perspective encourages curiosity about the individual's history. Asking questions like, "What happened to you?" rather than "What's wrong with you?" allows for more empathetic understanding of how these traits developed and how they might be addressed in treatment. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self image, and emotions, often accompanied by impulsivity. To meet the diagnostic criteria, individuals must exhibit five or more traits, and the mnemonic AM suicide provides a helpful way to remember these. Abandonment fears, a pervasive fear of real or imagined abandonment, often leading to frantic efforts to avoid rejection. Mood instability is intense and rapid emotional shifts, often referred to as mood swings. Suicidal or self mutilating behavior, recurrent thoughts, threats, or acts of self harm, including non suicidal self injurious behaviors, as a way to cope with emotional pain. Unstable and intense relationships. Relationships alternate between extremes of idealization, so like all good, and devaluation, all bad. Impulsivity often happens in areas like spending, sex, substance use, reckless driving, or binge eating. Controlling anger is difficult. Intense anger or frequent outbursts often disproportionate to the situation. There's an identity disturbance, an unstable sense of self marked by frequent shifts in goals, values, career plans, or self worth. Dissociative or paranoid symptoms. Transient dissociation or paranoia, often during periods of stress or perceived rejection. And lastly, emptiness, chronic emptiness. So, a persistent sense of inner void or lack of fulfillment, often described as feeling hollow or disconnected. So, we want to look at developmental and gender considerations. So, gender differences in presentation. So, in women, women are more likely to exhibit internalizing behaviors such as emotional dysregulation, self harm, and relational instability. And these traits align more closely with the stereotypical presentation of borderline personality disorder, contributing to frequent diagnosis in women. Men, however, are more likely to externalize their distress, presenting with aggression, impulsivity, substance use, and antisocial tendencies. And these patterns can lead to underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis as antisocial personality disorder or substance use disorders. And as far as an age appropriate diagnosis, borderline should generally not be diagnosed in individuals under 18 years old unless symptoms are persistent, severe, and meet all criteria. Many hallmark traits of borderline, such as identity disturbances, impulsivity, and mood instability, can reflect typical developmental process in adolescence, especially during Erickson's stage of identity versus role confusion. Diagnosing borderline in young people requires careful evaluation to differentiate between normal developmental challenges and pathological problems. I also want to talk to you about a subclinical presentation. So there's something out there that's being called quiet borderline. Not all individuals with borderline personality disorder exhibit outwardly dramatic symptoms. Subclinical presentations, often called quiet borderline, involve internalized distress and may not meet full diagnostic criteria despite causing clinically significant impairment. So, some key characteristics of this quiet borderline include emotions being turned inward, so intense self criticism, feelings of worthlessness, and chronic inner turmoil. Internalized anger, and it's often going to be that suppressed anger, and it's going to lead to self punishment or passive aggressive behaviors. There's going to be a fear of abandonment, withdrawal, or isolation to avoid rejection, making distress less visible to others. and a little subtle impulsivity. So, behaviors like overeating or self sabotage may be less evident, but they're still significant. So, this presentation requires a nuanced and empathetic approach as it might be mistaken for depression or anxiety and not a personality disorder. Cultural norms significantly influence how borderline traits are expressed and perceived. In individualistic cultures, might emphasize autonomy and emotional independence, potentially pathologizing individuals who demonstrate intense relational needs. In collectivist cultures, might be stigmatized behaviors that prioritize independence, complicating the presentation of fear of abandonment or relational instability. So, counselors have to consider these cultural contexts to avoid diagnostic bias and ensure that treatment aligns with the individual's values and environment. And I really like to conceptualize borderline as imagining the individual is constantly walking on a tightrope, just teetering between emotional safety and danger. This sort of black and white thinking where everything either feels all good or all bad is that key clinical indicator. Helping clients practice existing in the gray area is critical to their healing journey. And often, as a counselor, you're going to serve as that safety net to be able to catch that tightrope walker or just make them feel a little bit safer when they're taking risks walking on a tightrope. And I have an example here. It's the movie Girl Interrupted, and it provides this portrayal of borderline through the character of Susanna Kaysen, and that one's played by Winona Ryder. So, this one scene that I'm going to show you, Susanna's impulsive behaviors, mood instability, and she's struggling with identity. It all illustrates several hallmark symptoms of borderline. Her character arc highlights that pervasive sense of emptiness and fear of abandonment that drive her actions. So, if you haven't seen the movie or read the book, I highly recommend it. You'll see examples and evidence of a lot of the personality disorders that we're talking about here in other characters. You will see some OCD, a severe eating disorder, grandiose delusions, sociopathic tendencies, substance use, and bipolar disorder, and it's from 1999 and it's set in the 60s, so it's a bit old. And the treatments shown are definitely a sign of the times, but it also has a great cast that really went from this movie and catapulted into like some really big things. So definitely worth a watch if you have a spare 2 hours. But here's a clip right now.
Am I in trouble for kissing an orderly or giving my boyfriend a blowjob?
Melvin says you have some very interesting theories about your illness. You believe there is a mystical undertow in life, quicksands of shadows.
Yeah, and another one of my theories is that you people don't know what you're doing.
Still, you acknowledge there is a problem coping with this quicksand.
You know, I have a problem coping with this hospital. I want to leave.
I can't do that.
I signed myself in. I should be able to sign myself out.
You signed yourself into our care. We decide when you leave. You're not ready for it, Susanna. Your progress has plateaued. Does that disappoint you?
I'm ambivalent. In fact, that's my new favorite word.
Do you know what that means, ambivalence?
I don't care.
If it's your favorite word, I would have thought you
It
would.
means I don't care. That's what it means.
On the contrary, Susanna, ambivalence suggests strong feelings. In opposition, the prefix, as in ambidextrous, means both. The rest of it, in Latin, means vigor. The word suggests that you are torn between two opposing courses of action.
Will I stay or will I go?
Am I sane or am I crazy?
Those aren't courses of action.
They can be, dear. For some.
Well, then it's the wrong word.
No. I think it's perfect. Quis hic locus quae regia, quae mundis plaga. What world is this? What kingdom? What shores of what worlds? It's a very big question you're faced with, Susanna. the choice of your life. How much will you indulge in your flaws? What are your flaws? Are they flaws? If you embrace them, will you commit yourself to hospital for life? Big questions, big decisions. Not surprising you profess carelessness about them.
So, some additional insights on borderline personality disorder. I know I'm really talking about this one quite a bit. It is pretty common that you'll see in treatment, so I want to make sure that you are well prepared and understand it. Borderline traits often develop as adaptive responses to trauma, neglect, or invalidating environments. So, those abandonment fears reflect inconsistent caregiving or rejection. Self harm serves as a coping mechanism for overwhelming emotions or a way to regain control. Relational instability reflects the yearning for connection while struggling to trust due to past betrayals. And borderline personality disorder is closely linked to disorganized attachment styles, where caregivers were both a source of comfort and fear. So, a lot of these behaviors you might be able to frame as a way to self soothe when attachment needs are going unmet through the primary caretaker or through that primary attachment relationship. And just some statistics here, up to 80% of individuals with borderline report histories of neglect, abuse, or inconsistent caregiving. And symptoms can be viewed just as an adaptive strategy learned in response to unsafe environments rather than inherent characteristic flaws. As far as treatment goes for borderline personality disorder, when we're taking a non pathologizing approach, we want to understand symptoms as survival mechanisms and shift towards building resilience and emotional regulation. So, skills like emotional regulation through DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. We would also want to look at potentially repairing attachment wounds if you're looking through an attachment theory lens. We want to foster self compassion. Nearly 50% of individuals diagnosed with borderline personality disorder no longer meet criteria 10 years later, emphasizing the potential for recovery. And research suggests that borderline personality disorder is often misdiagnosed in individuals who may better meet criteria for a dissociative disorder, such as dissociative identity disorder or other specified dissociative disorder. So, both borderline and dissociative disorders share features like emotional dysregulation, dissociative symptoms, and histories of trauma, which can complicate an accurate diagnosis. Studies highlight individuals with dissociative identity disorder frequently receive prior diagnoses of borderline personality disorder, reflecting a pattern of diagnostic overshadowing where dissociative symptoms are attributed to borderline. Pathological dissociation is more strongly associated with severe and earlier trauma exposure, distinguishing it from the transient and stress related dissociative symptoms seen in borderline. These overlaps emphasize the importance of thorough clinical assessment to explore the function and persistence of dissociative symptoms, helping to ensure appropriate treatment for individuals presenting with complex trauma histories and emotional instability. So we're getting towards the end of our list. We have two more to go. We're going to do histrionic personality disorder, and then we have narcissistic personality disorder. So histrionic personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of excessive emotionality and attention-seeking behavior. To meet diagnostic criteria, individuals must exhibit 5 or more traits, and the mnemonic here is praise me. P is for provocative or sexually seductive behavior. Individuals may use sexual or provocative behavior to draw attention or influence others. Relationships are considered more intimate than they are. They often overestimate the closeness of relationships. Attention seeking. They feel uncomfortable or unappreciated when they are not the center of attention. Influenced easily by others, they're highly suggestible and may adopt the opinions or behaviors of those around them. Style of speech is impressionistic and lacks detail, so you might notice that their conversations are often vague and lacking depth, focusing on superficial impressions. Emotions are rapidly shifting and shallow. Emotional expressions are exaggerated and seem insincere or situationally dependent. You might notice that they're made up or physically attention seeking. So they use appearance to draw attention, often dressing provocatively or in a way that just stands out. They have an exaggerated or theatrical emotion. So their emotional displays are dramatic, over the top, and disproportionate to the situation. So behaviors associated with histrionic personality disorder can be understood as survival mechanisms developed in response to detached or inconsistent caregiving environments. In households where caregivers were overwhelmed by addiction, mental health issues, or domestic violence, a child might learn to seek attention and validation externally, developing exaggerated behaviors to ensure that their needs got met. If a secure attachment was absent or dysfunctional, these patterns could become ingrained as coping mechanisms. So, we'd want to rule out manic or hypomanic episodes, a dependent personality disorder, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And this is the first time we're really talking about this one. So, I just want to lay it out very clearly. Some behaviors seen in histrionic personality disorders, such as impulsivity and social difficulties, may overlap with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. However, fetal alcohol is associated with specific neurological and developmental markers that differentiate it from a personality disorder. And cultural norms and expectations around emotional expression, dress, and social behavior must be taken into account. In some cultures, behaviors might seem dramatic or attention seeking, but they could be culturally normative. Misdiagnosis can occur if counselors do not assess these behaviors within the appropriate cultural context. And some fictional examples from the media is Regina George from Mean Girls. Regina thrives on being the center of attention, controls her social environment through manipulation, and exaggerates emotions for effect. Harley Quinn from DC Comics. Harley displays shallow, shifting emotions, exaggerated theatrically, and provocative behavior while striving for attention and validation. There's also a really oldie but a goodie, Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. Scarlett embodies many histrionic personality disorder traits using charm, drama, and that good old fashioned Southern attention seeking to navigate her relationships and social standing. And then I just want to kind of touch base on some reality stars out there. So many participants on dating or competition shows demonstrate traits like exaggerated emotions and provocative behavior. However, it's important to recognize that the performative nature of reality television, where individuals may be playing up traits for entertainment purposes. So they may or may not actually meet criteria for a personality disorder, but it might look like it from how they're edited. And the last one on our list today is narcissistic personality disorder with that mnemonic special. So we're looking for 5 or more of the following traits: sense of self importance, belief in their own superiority, expecting admiration and recognition as being exceptional without proportional achievements. So maybe somebody truly is exceptional and they're looking for some admiration or some recognition. That's one thing. But when they haven't earned it, that's a different. Preoccupied with fantasies, so there might be some persistent thoughts about unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. There's a sense of entitlement, so an unreasonable expectation of favorable treatment or compliance with their expectations. Conceited, as in displays of arrogance or haughty in behavior or attitude. Interpersonal exploitation. So they might use others to achieve their own goals, often without regard for the other person's feelings or needs. Arrogant and disdainful. Behaviors and attitudes that suggest that they feel superior to others and dismissive of others' worth or contributions. And lacks empathy, difficulty recognizing or caring about emotions or needs of others, though not all individuals with narcissistic personality disorder completely lack empathy. So, while it's often characterized by a lack of empathy, it is essential to differentiate between individuals who are unable to express empathy due to emotional detachment and those who are unwilling due to fear or defensiveness. So, for example, unwillingness to empathize may stem from early trauma, neglect, or invalidation, where vulnerability was unsafe and punished. So we want to differentiate narcissistic personality disorder from just a person with high self esteem. Healthy self esteem may involve confidence and assertiveness, but narcissistic personality disorder often involves a grandiose and exaggerated sense of self worth that comes at the expense of others. It's important to distinguish narcissistic traits from culturally accepted displays of high self esteem or competitive behaviors. So many individuals with narcissistic traits may have grown up in environments where their worth was tied to achievement or outward success. And this can result in a hyper focus on external validation to compensate for feelings of inadequacy or difficulty showing vulnerability, as emotional openness was punished or ignored in their formative years. So, differential diagnosis, we'd want to consider antisocial personality disorder. Both involve exploitation, but individuals with narcissistic personality disorder focus on admiration and validation, while antisocial personality disorder involves a disregard for societal norms and laws. We'd want to rule out manic or hypomanic episodes. Grandiosity during mania is episodic, it comes and it goes, where narcissistic personality disorder traits are pervasive and persistent. They stick and they stay. We'd also want to rule out obsessive compulsive disorder. So, individuals with OCD may display perfectionism or rigidity, but lack the exploitive and admiration seeking behaviors of narcissistic personality disorder. And some fictional examples from the media. Don Draper from Mad Men exudes charm, confidence. He's engaging and exploitive in his relationships and maintains this inflated sense of self. There's Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, preoccupied with his appearance, his wealth, his status, and views others as tools for his gain. There's Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. She displays entitlement, arrogance, and a lack of empathy, all in service of consolidating power. And we're going to talk about Walter White again because I just really love Breaking Bad. And I know I just used him as an example for antisocial personality disorder, but remember for that one, we had to meet criteria for conduct disorder at age 15. And I don't think that he actually does or that he would. So he wouldn't technically meet criteria for antisocial. So let's use narcissistic as a differential lens for him. So he begins as this relatable figure, but evolves into somebody driven by power and validation at any cost. So it seems like narcissistic personality disorder would be a better fit for him. And then, last but not least, my favorite, Michael Scott from The Office. A more lighthearted example, he craves admiration and recognition, but occasionally displays empathy and self awareness, making him a nuanced portrayal. And again, with reality TV, I think reality TV just attracts individuals with narcissistic or attention seeking traits due to the nature of the medium. So, inviting a public open window into one's life appeals to those seeking admiration, validation, or a platform for grandiosity. However, it's important to distinguish between behaviors amplified for entertainment and those reflective of true narcissistic tendencies. So, we can't diagnose anybody we see on TV, and I wouldn't recommend it. But for the fictional characters, have at it. So, to recap, narcissistic personality disorder involves pervasive patterns of grandiosity, entitlement, and a need for admiration that can significantly impact relationships and functioning. By understanding the origins and functions of those behaviors, counselors can adopt a more empathetic and effective approach addressing the underlying vulnerabilities that drive narcissistic traits. So that's all the diagnostic criteria for the personality disorders. I do just want to touch on a few other parts of this that are going to apply to all the personality disorders. So, suicidal ideation and behaviors are significantly more prevalent among individuals with personality disorders compared to the general population. The elevated risk likely arises from the interplay of emotional dysregulation, relational instability, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness that can accompany these diagnoses. Individuals with personality disorders often struggle to conform to societal norms, leading to experiences of marginalization, conflict, and disempowerment, which may exacerbate feelings of despair. So, borderline personality disorder and suicide risk. Among personality disorders, borderline personality disorder is associated with the highest risk of suicide. Studies indicate that up to 70% of individuals with borderline will attempt suicide at least once in their lifetime, and approximately 10% of individuals with borderline will die by suicide, a rate 50 times higher than the general population. So, this heightened risk is reflected in the diagnostic criteria, which includes recurrent suicidal behaviors, gestures, or threats, as well as self mutilating behaviors. And if you remember the mnemonic, it's embedded in there for you to remember that when you're diagnosing, always, always, always check for suicide risk. And while the highest prevalence of suicide attempts is seen in borderline, other personality disorders also carry elevated risks. So, for antisocial personality disorder, impulsivity and aggression may lead to high risk behaviors, including suicide attempts. Avoidant and personality disorders, feelings of isolation, worthlessness, and hopelessness can increase suicide risk, though the behaviors may be less overt than in borderline. And narcissistic personality disorder, risk can spike following experiences of perceived failure, rejection, or narcissistic injury, undermining the individual's sense of superiority. And you can focus on empathy and trauma informed care. It's critical. Suicide assessment tools are valuable, but must be paired with a compassionate and individualized approach. So you're going to ask directly, include questions about passive death wish, active suicidal thoughts, plans, access, means, and previous attempts. We're going to use reflective listening and open ended questions to explore the intensity of emotional distress. We're going to be mindful that discussing suicidal thoughts can evoke feelings of shame or fear of judgment in clients. And we're going to recognize that many individuals with personality disorders have histories of trauma that contribute to their distress and coping mechanisms. So, recent studies offer additional insights into the relationship between personality disorders and suicide risk. So, a meta analysis published in 2021 found that 30 to 40% of individuals with any personality disorder report lifetime suicidal ideation, with 15 to 25% reporting suicide attempts. Risk is heightened in individuals with comorbid conditions such as major depressive disorder, PTSD, or substance use disorders. And individuals with personality disorders are 8 to 10 times more likely to die by suicide compared to the general population. So I put this quote here from the author David Foster Wallace, who wrote Infinite Jest and himself died from completed suicide. And I think it's important, if you've ever been in the shoes of somebody who has considered this, to build some empathy around suicidal thinking. And I think this writing does just that. So I'm just going to stop talking and give you a second to read this and just think about it. And so, when assessing for suicide, yes, ask all the questions on your assessment tools, but do so in a way of recognizing that there could be something much worse feeling when being alive. Bring all your care and empathy and trauma informed skills to the table always, but especially here. And when evaluating behaviors that may appear atypical, it's crucial to differentiate between behaviors that reflect personality disorders and those that are normative within the person's cultural or subcultural context. Acculturation, the process of adapting a new or dominant culture, can shape behaviors, beliefs, and emotional responses in ways that may be misunderstood or mischaracterized in clinical settings. Behaviors that seem unusual or maladaptive in one cultural framework may be normative in another. Cultural values, shared beliefs, and traditions influence how individuals express emotions, interact with others, and respond to stressors. So, examples include parental and familial roles. Certain cultures place greater emphasis on hierarchical family structures, which may appear overly dependent or controlling in frameworks, but are normative within the cultural context. Suspiciousness or guardedness. Minority groups or immigrant populations may exhibit defensive or guarded behaviors due to lived experiences of marginalization, systemic discrimination, or historical oppression. The suspiciousness and the guardedness is warranted here. And as far as expression of emotions, some cultures prioritize stoicism and emotional restraint, which may be misinterpreted as flattened affect or avoidance. We also want to consider how intergenerational trauma can play a significant role in shaping behaviors, schemas, and emotional responses across generations. So, for example, if a grandparent experienced trauma such as war or displacement, they may adopt a worldview that prioritizes vigilance and mistrust to ensure survival. These beliefs can be transmitted to subsequent generations through caregiving practices and communication. And a family may collectively adopt beliefs like the world is unsafe or trust no one, not as pathology, but as survival strategy rooted in historical trauma. And these behaviors should not be confused with paranoia or personality pathology. They're adaptive responses to perceived or actual threat experienced over generations. So, we want to assess for normativity, explore whether behaviors are typical within the individual's cultural or subcultural context before attributing them to pathology. Use culturally sensitive tools. Use assessment instruments validated for diverse populations and avoid applying westernized norms universally. And just recognize the role of intergenerational trauma and historical oppression in shaping behaviors and schemas. We want to engage in ongoing education about the cultural backgrounds of clients to improve accuracy of assessments and interventions. So, I made you a little cheat sheet list of things that you might not generally consider in an assessment, but you do want to look at the following things on this bulleted list when we're looking at cultural norms, differences, and acculturation: shared beliefs, values, customs, behaviors, traditions, institution, art, folklore, lifestyle. It's all important. And when diagnosing personality disorders, it's essential to avoid biases based on stereotypical gender roles. Historically, societal expectations and cultural norms have influenced the overdiagnosis of certain personality disorders in one gender over another. So, women who are biologically female are more frequently diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, or dependent personality disorder. And this may reflect societal norms that emphasize emotional expressiveness, relational dependency, or appearance, leading to biased interpretation of these traits as pathological, which they very well may not be. Men who are biologically male are more often diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, reflecting cultural expectations around assertiveness, dominance, and independence that may obscure other underlying issues or misrepresent normative behavior as pathology. So, the culture in which a person grew up significantly shapes their behavior and personality traits. In patriarchal societies, men may be encouraged to suppress emotions and exhibit dominance, while women may be socialized to prioritize relationships and emotional labor. Behaviors that align with these gender norms may be represented as symptoms of personality disorders without considering the broader societal context. So, some key questions to ask: are these behaviors markedly different from what's expected within the individual's cultural or familial context? Are the traits causing functional impairment or subjective distress, or are they adaptive within their environment? So, again, personality traits become a disorder only when it meets specific criteria. Inflexible, the behavior is rigid and unchanging across contexts. Maladaptive, the behavior causes problems in functioning in relationships. Persistent, the behavior persists over time and is not situational or episodic. And impairment or distress, the individual experiences significant functional impairment or subjective distress. So, it's important to differentiate between traits that others may find challenging or uncomfortable versus those that genuinely impair the individual's ability to navigate life successfully. If someone's traits do not disrupt their relationships, career, or personal well being, then it may not be appropriate to pathologize or diagnose them with a personality disorder. When diagnosing personality disorders such as paranoid schizophrenia, schizoid, or schizotypal personality disorders, it's critical to ensure that the symptoms do not occur exclusively during episodes of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or depressive disorders with psychotic features. Personality disorders are characterized by stable, pervasive patterns of behaviors and cognition that persist across time and settings. In contrast, psychotic features in mood disorders are episodic and closely tied to mood states such as mania or depression. And paranoia in personality disorder is persistent and context independent, while paranoia in a mood disorder typically aligns with mood episodes and may resolve between them. Another key distinction is that psychotic features in mood disorders are often mood congruent, so grandiosity during mania or worthlessness during depression, whereas in personality disorders, eccentric beliefs or paranoid ideation may lack this alignment with a mood. Functional impairment also differs. Personality disorders involve long standing relational or social dysfunction, while mood disorders with psychotic features often present acute impairments during episodes. Careful assessment of symptom duration, context, and functional impact is essential to differentiate between these conditions and ensure accurate diagnosis and effective treatment. Personality disorders are characterized by long-standing pervasive patterns of behavior that cause clinically significant impairments in psychosocial functioning. Accurate diagnosis requires differentiating personality disorders from mood and psychotic disorders, as well as substance use disorders, which can present with similar symptoms. It's essential to ensure that conditions such as addiction or mood disorders are in remission before diagnosing a personality disorder, or to confirm that the personality disordered behavior predates these conditions. Many treatment centers restrict admission for individuals with personality disorders, citing the need for higher levels of care, yet systemic gaps leave these individuals with few options to step down in care. This highlights the need for systemic change and a shift in the narrative around personality disorders. Instead of viewing them solely as pathological, we should consider these behaviors as adaptations or survival mechanisms developed in response to trauma. Reframing the dialogue in this way can reduce stigma, improve access to care, and foster more effective, compassionate treatment approaches.